Hey there, welcome to Dr. Pickleface, the place for crazy stories you won't forget. If you like big surprises, wild drama, and little sweet revenge, you're in the right spot. Subscribe and jump into tales that will make you gasp, laugh, and keep you watching for more. Fun characters, shocking twists, and endings that feel so good. That's Dr. Pickleface. Hit the bell and let's start the fun.
What the hell is this doing here?
The flash drive sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded tool. I'd found it taped under my work truck's bumper after another humiliating day fixing the Hendersons' busted AC unit. Natalie had shown up halfway through the job with her teacher friend Sarah, both of them giggling as I crawled out from under their house, covered in dirt and coolant. Clay looks like he's been wrestling with more than just ductwork, Natalie had said, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Maybe if you'd finished college like your father wanted, you wouldn't be crawling around in the dirt at 36. Sarah had laughed. At least he's getting exercise. I'd said nothing, just packed my tools and left. Now I stared at this anonymous USB drive, my hands still shaking from rage and something else. Fear, maybe. The kind that comes when you know your world's about to crack open. The first file was audio. Poor quality, but clear enough. God, Charles, what if Clay finds out? Natalie's voice, breathless. My son's too stupid to figure anything out. Always has been. My father's voice, that familiar cold certainty. 20 years I've been telling him he's worthless. Think he's going to grow a brain now? I sat in my crumbling cottage kitchen, listening to my wife and my father discuss their affair like I was some neighborhood dog they needed to avoid. He suspects something, Natalie said. Last night he asked why I was working so late. So, you're a teacher. Tell him you're grading papers. Clay believes whatever keeps his pathetic world intact. The audio crackled. Bed springs. Then my father's voice again. Evelyn doesn't know either. That woman's been sleepwalking through life for 30 years. As long as her credit cards work, she doesn't ask questions. I stopped the recording. My chest felt like someone had filled it with concrete. 23 years of marriage to Natalie. 36 years as Charles Dawson's disappointment of a son. My mother Evelyn, always taking their side, always explaining why I needed to try harder to earn my father's respect. The second file contained bank statements, joint accounts I didn't know existed, property transfers dated 2 months ago, my name forged on documents selling the cottage, the only thing my grandfather had left me that my father couldn't touch. They'd been planning this for months. I poured 3 fingers of bourbon and called the only person in this godforsaken lakeside town who'd ever had my back. Elena here. My coworker's voice was sharp, alert despite the late hour. It's Clay. I need to see you. Tonight. Jesus, you sound like someone died. What's wrong? Everything. Can you come over? 20 minutes later, Elena Martinez sat at my kitchen table, her dark eyes scanning the documents I'd printed. She was 5'0", but had the backbone of a steel beam, the kind of woman who'd survived 3 layoffs at the plant before landing at our HVAC company. Holy shit, Clay. She looked up from the papers. They forged your signature on the cottage deed? Keep reading. She pulled up the audio files on her laptop. We listened in silence as my father described exactly how worthless his son was, how easy it would be to push me out of everything once the divorce went through. That's some cold-blooded planning, Elena said. How long you think this has been going on? Based on these bank records, at least a year, maybe longer. Elena leaned back in her chair. So what are you going to do? Lawyer up? Divorce court's going to love these recordings. I stared at the flash drive. Someone had risked a lot to get me this information. Someone who wanted Charles and Natalie to burn. I'm not going to court, I said. Clay, you can't just... Court means they control the narrative. Natalie's already been telling people I'm unstable. PTSD from Afghanistan, drinking problem, anger issues. I gestured at the cottage around us. Look at this place. Look at me. Who's a judge going to believe? Elena nodded slowly. She'd seen how this town worked. Charles Dawson owned half the businesses, sat on the city council, had his fingers in every pie that mattered. His son, the dropout veteran, not so much. So what then? She asked. I thought about the humiliation in the Hendersons' driveway, about 20 years of my father's disappointed sighs and cutting remarks, about Natalie's sweet smile hiding a knife. I'm going to disappear for a while, I said. Let them think they've won. And then? Then I'm going to tear their world apart piece by piece. I moved out of the cottage the next morning before Natalie got home from school. Left no note, took only what fit in my truck. Elena helped me load my tools and a duffel bag of clothes while neighbors watched from their windows. Where are you planning to go?" she asked as I threw the last toolbox in the bed. "Got a buddy from my unit who runs a garage up in Duluth. Owes me some favors." Elena handed me a prepaid phone. "Stay in touch. And Clay, don't do anything stupid." I drove out of town without looking back. For 6 weeks, I worked on Tommy Fletcher's loading dock, hauling scrap metal and keeping my head down. But nights, I planned. I researched. I learned things about my family that made the affair look like a parking ticket. Charles had been skimming from city contracts for years, hiding the money in accounts linked to shell companies. Natalie had been covering up a sexual harassment complaint at her school, using her position on the union board to bury it. My mother, Evelyn? She'd known about all of it and stayed quiet because she'd rather be rich and miserable than poor and honest. The anonymous flash drive had been just the beginning. I drove back to town on a Tuesday in March, when the lake ice was breaking up and everything smelled like mud and dying winter. Elena met me at a diner outside the city limits. "Jesus, you look different," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. I'd lost 30 pounds and gained something harder in my eyes. 6 weeks of 12-hour shifts and 8 hours of planning had burned away whatever softness I'd been carrying. "How are things at home?" I asked. "Natalie's been playing the grieving wife. Tells everyone you had another breakdown, might be dangerous. Charles has been real public about how worried he is for his troubled son." "And the cottage?" "Sold. Fast sale to some development company out of Minneapolis. Bulldozers start next month." I sipped my coffee and felt nothing. That should have hurt, losing the last piece of my grandfather's legacy. Instead, it just felt like confirmation that I'd made the right choice. "I need you to do something for me," I said. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Your cousin Danny still work at the courthouse?" "Yeah. Why?" I slid a folded paper across the table. "I need him to file these documents, quietly." Elena unfolded the paper and read. Her eyes widened. "Clay, this is a legal business partnership. Martinez Dawson Consulting. You're 51% owner, I'm 49. We specialize in construction oversight and regulatory compliance." "What the hell does that mean?" "It means we're going to be the company that reviews Charles's building projects for city compliance. Danny files that paperwork. We're officially a registered business entity eligible for municipal contracts." Elena stared at me. "You want to spy on your own father?" "I want to audit him, legally. There's a difference." She folded the paper and put it in her jacket. "This is either brilliant or completely insane. Maybe both." I drove to a motel on the edge of town and checked in under the business name. Room 127, overlooking the parking lot of Charles's construction company. From my window, I could see his black Cadillac and Natalie's Honda in the spaces marked reserved for management. They'd moved fast. She was already working in his office, probably had been for months before I'd found out. I unpacked my surveillance equipment, stuff I'd learned to use in the Army, and upgraded with Tommy Fletcher's help. Nothing illegal, just cameras, long-range microphones, and software that could clean up audio from 100 yards away. By midnight, I had a clear view of Charles's office and a listening device in the vent system, installed during my HVAC consultation that afternoon. Amazing how easy it was to get access when you knew where all the weak spots were. The first recording I got made everything worthwhile. "We need to move faster on the Clay situation," Natalie's voice sharp with worry. "Relax. He's gone. Probably drinking himself to death in some dive bar up north." Charles sounded bored. "Even if he comes back, what's he going to do? Sue us? With what money? What if he has recordings? What if he knows about the accounts?" "Impossible. Clay couldn't balance his own checkbook, let alone figure out offshore banking." I smiled in the dark of my motel room. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Elena's cousin Danny proved more useful than I'd expected. 24 hours after filing our partnership papers, Martinez Dawson Consulting had a city contract to review construction permits for code compliance. Not a big contract, but enough to give us legitimate access to Charles's projects. "How'd you swing this so fast?" Elena asked, studying the paperwork. "Charles has been cutting corners on safety inspections for years. City Council finally noticed when the Riverside Elementary roof collapsed last winter. They need independent oversight, and we're the newest firm in town. Clean slate." What I didn't tell her was that I'd been the one who'd anonymously tipped off 3 council members about the roof issue, complete with documentation showing Charles's company had used substandard materials and skipped required inspections. Our first official site visit was to the new lakefront condos Charles was building, luxury units for wealthy retirees, the kind of project that would cement his reputation and net millions in profit. Elena and I showed up Tuesday morning with clipboards and hard hats. The foreman, a guy named Steve I'd known since high school, waved us through without much interest. Foundation inspection, I told him. Just routine compliance check. What we found in the concrete samples made my week. Charles had cut the rebar specifications by 40% and used cheap aggregate that wouldn't pass inspection in any legitimate review. The foundation would hold for maybe 5 years before developing stress fractures. This is criminal, Elena muttered, photographing the core samples. People are going to live in these things. Not for long, I said. File the report with the city. Full documentation. Copy to the State Building Authority. Clay, this'll shut down the whole project. Your father will lose everything he's invested. That's the point. By Thursday, the city had issued a stop work order. By Friday, Charles was screaming at anyone who'd listen about corrupt inspectors and sabotage. The local paper ran a front-page story about construction safety concerns, complete with quotes from anonymous industry experts about the prevalence of corner cutting in local projects. I watched from my motel window as Charles paced his office, shouting into his phone. Natalie sat at her desk, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The second phase of my plan required more finesse. Rick Maddox had been Charles's business partner for 15 years, handling security and personnel issues. Ex-cop, suspicious by nature, smart enough to be dangerous. He'd never liked me, but he was also the kind of man who valued loyalty above everything else. I arranged to meet him at Murphy's Bar, the kind of place where construction workers drank away their paychecks and conversations stayed private. Clay Dawson, Rick said, sliding into the booth across from me. Heard you'd skipped town. Took some time to think. About family loyalty, about who I can trust. Rick's eyes narrowed. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of steady gaze that came from 20 years of reading people's lies. What do you want? I slid a manila envelope across the table. Found these cleaning out my grandfather's papers. Thought you should see them. Rick opened the envelope and pulled out photocopied bank statements. Fake ones, but good fakes, showing regular transfers from Charles's business account to an offshore shell company. The amounts were substantial. The timing coincided with every major project Rick had helped secure. What the hell is this? Rick asked. Looks like someone's been skimming contract money. See those dates? Everyone matches a project you brought in, almost like they were waiting for you to deliver before they started moving money offshore. Rick's face went dark. You're saying Charles has been stealing from deals I set up? I'm not saying anything. I'm showing you documents I found in a dead man's filing cabinet. I let him study the papers. Rick was smart enough to verify the account numbers, trace the shell company registrations. He'd find enough legitimate information mixed with the fakes to make it all seem credible. Why bring this to me? He asked finally. Because I know you're an honest man. Because you've been busting your ass for 15 years while someone's been laughing at you behind closed doors. I stood up and dropped a 20 on the table. Do whatever you think is right. 3 days later, Elena called me from the courthouse. Rick Maddox just filed a civil suit against your father, claiming breach of fiduciary duty and theft of partnership assets. He's demanding a full audit of the business accounts. How much is he asking for? $3 million, plus interest and punitive damages. I hung up and poured myself a bourbon. Outside my motel window, Charles's Cadillac sat in its reserved spot, but the office lights were on well past midnight. The cracks were starting to show. The beauty of a good plan is watching it unfold like dominoes falling in slow motion. Rick's lawsuit forced Charles to freeze the business accounts while lawyers sorted through 15 years of financial records. The condo project remained shut down, bleeding money in permit fees and delayed construction loans. 3 other projects got flagged for routine safety inspections that somehow kept finding problems. But I was just getting started. Natalie's weak point had always been her reputation. She'd built her identity around being the perfect teacher, the respected community member, the woman who did everything right. In a town this size, reputation was everything. The complaint letters started arriving at the school district office on a Monday morning. Parents expressing concern about Miss Dawson's inappropriate behavior during parent-teacher conferences. Nothing criminal, nothing actionable, just enough discomfort to make administrators nervous. I don't understand what's happening. Natalie's voice carried clearly through the surveillance equipment I'd installed in Charles's office. 3 parents complained that I was overly familiar during conferences. What does that even mean? Probably nothing, Charles said. but he sounded distracted. People are looking for someone to blame for their kids' problems. The union rep wants to meet with me tomorrow. Says there might be a formal inquiry. I smiled, adjusting the audio levels on my recording equipment. The beauty of anonymous complaints was that they didn't require proof, just enough smoke to suggest fire. And I'd made sure to target parents whose children had gotten poor grades in Natalie's class, people who already had reasons to dislike her. The union meeting didn't go well for Natalie. I knew this because I'd convinced Elena to apply for a substitute teaching position, which gave her access to the district's internal communications. Nothing illegal, just professional networking that happened to keep me informed. They're putting her on administrative leave, Elena reported over dinner at a truck stop outside town, pending a full investigation into her conduct standards. How long will that take? Could be months. Union has to investigate every complaint, interview students, review her personnel files. Even if they clear her, she'll be toxic. Parents won't want their kids in her classes. I thought about Natalie sitting at home, watching her carefully constructed life crumble while she tried to figure out where the attacks were coming from. What about the harassment thing? I asked. Elena's expression darkened. Found the file, buried deep in union records, but it's there. Male colleague complained that Natalie offered to improve his performance reviews in exchange for personal favors. Union buried it rather than deal with the scandal. Any proof? Emails, witness statements, enough to destroy her if it ever went public. I paid the check and walked Elena to her car. The night air smelled like snow and dying leaves, that particular Midwest scent that always reminded me why I joined the Army. Clay, what you're doing to them, it's working. But are you sure this is what you want? Your father's business is hemorrhaging money. Natalie's career is basically over. At some point, they're going to figure out this isn't coincidence. I looked across the dark parking lot toward the distant lights of town, my town, or at least it had been once. They spent 20 years making me feel worthless, I said. Convinced me I was too stupid, too damaged, too broken to matter. Now they get to find out what worthless really feels like. Elena nodded but didn't look happy about it. Just be careful. Desperate people do stupid things. She was right, of course. But I was counting on that. The first sign that Charles was cracking came through the surveillance feeds. 3 weeks after Rick's lawsuit hit the papers, I watched my father throw a coffee mug across his office hard enough to shatter the window. How the hell does a safety inspection find problems that weren't there last month? He was shouting at someone on the phone. We built that foundation to spec, ran every test, followed every goddamn regulation. What he didn't know was that Martinez-Dawson Consulting had been conducting follow-up inspections on projects that had passed their initial reviews. Amazing how many new problems you could find when you knew where to look and had access to updated safety standards. The Riverside Shopping Center was the latest casualty. Elena had discovered that the parking structure used an outdated concrete mix that met 2015 standards but failed current earthquake safety requirements. The city had no choice but to order a complete rebuild. That's another $2 million down the drain, Charles told Natalie during one of their increasingly frequent crisis meetings. At this rate, we'll be bankrupt by Christmas. What about the insurance claims? Natalie asked. Insurance doesn't cover regulatory compliance issues. They're calling it failure to maintain current standards. Might as well be act of God for all the good it does us. I watched Natalie's face on the monitor. She was starting to understand that the walls were closing in. The psychological pressure was working exactly as planned. Charles had spent his whole life controlling situations through money and political connections. Strip away those advantages, make him reactive instead of proactive, and he started making mistakes. The biggest mistake came when he tried to pressure city council members to ease up on the safety inspections. I'd been monitoring his phone calls through a device Elena had installed during a routine HVAC maintenance call to his office. Most of the conversations were boring business talk, but Thursday afternoon gave me gold. Tom, it's Charles. Look, this inspector harassment has gone too far. 3 projects shut down in 1 month? That's not quality control, that's sabotage. Tom Brennan, city council president, sounded uncomfortable. Charles, I can't interfere with legitimate safety inspections. You know that. Legitimate? Come on. These Martinez-Dawson people show up out of nowhere and suddenly every project in town has critical safety issues? Someone's paying them to find problems. You have proof of that? I don't need proof. I need you to remember who contributed to your last 3 campaigns. The line went quiet for a long moment. Charles, are you trying to pressure me to interfere with public safety inspections? I'm reminding you that friendship goes both ways. This conversation is over. The call ended with a click that might as well have been a gunshot. Within an hour, Tom Brennan had forwarded a recording of the conversation to the state attorney general's office and the local FBI field agent. By Friday morning, Charles Dawson was under federal investigation for attempted bribery of public officials. I celebrated with a bottle of bourbon and a view of Charles's office, where the lights stayed on past midnight while he presumably tried to figure out how his perfectly controlled world was falling apart. Evelyn showed up at my motel on a gray Sunday morning in November, driving her white Lexus like she was heading to church instead of confronting the son she'd helped destroy. I watched her through the window, sitting in her car for 10 minutes before finally walking to my door. She looked older than I remembered, smaller, like the weight of her choices was physically crushing her. "Hello, Clay," she said when I opened the door. "Mother." We stood there for a moment, two strangers connected by blood and 20 years of accumulated damage. "May I come in?" I stepped aside and let her enter the motel room that had become my base of operations. She looked around at the surveillance equipment, the wall covered with photos and documents, the multiple computer screens showing live feeds from Charles's office and Natalie's apartment. "My God," she whispered. "What have you become?" "Your son," I said. Finally. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying. "Charles is talking about selling the house," she said. "The legal bills are eating through our savings. The business is essentially bankrupt. He thinks if we can liquidate our assets, we might be able to start over somewhere else." Sounds reasonable. "Is it you? All of this destruction, is it you?" I poured coffee from the pot on the dresser and handed her a cup. "What do you think?" "I think my son is brilliant when he wants to be. I think he learned more in the army than anyone gave him credit for. And I think—" She paused, staring into her coffee. "I think I failed you 20 years ago when I should have chosen my child over my comfort." "You think?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "When you came back from Afghanistan, when you were struggling with the nightmares and the drinking, Charles said you were weak, said coddling you would only make it worse. I believed him because it was easier than fighting him. And when I got sober, when I was trying to rebuild my life, he said you'd never amount to anything. Said the best thing we could do was let you fail on your own terms so you'd stop being a burden on the family." I sat down across from her at the small table. "What did you say?" "Nothing." I said nothing. The tears were flowing freely now. I watched my son disappear into that cottage, watched him accept scraps from a father who despised him, watched him marry a woman who was using him, and I said nothing because speaking up would have meant losing my comfortable life. And now? Now I'm losing everything anyway. Charles is drinking again. Natalie moved out last week after some screaming fight about money. Rick won't return our calls. The whole town thinks we're criminals. I studied my mother's face, looking for manipulation or self-pity. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine remorse. "Why are you here, Evelyn?" "Because I want to know what you need from me." "Need from you?" "To forgive me, to stop this war, to let us try to be a family again." I laughed, and the sound was harsh enough to make her flinch. "A family? Mother, Charles has been stealing from the city for 20 years. Natalie has been covering up sexual harassment complaints and sleeping with my father. You've been enabling both of them while treating me like a shameful secret. We were never a family. We were just people with the same last name." Evelyn wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "What if I testified? What if I told the FBI everything I know about Charles's business dealings?" That got my attention. "What do you know?" "Bank account numbers, shell company registrations, names of contractors who paid bribes for city contracts. 20 years worth of evidence that I kept quiet about because I was afraid of being poor." I stared at her. "You'd destroy your own husband?" "I already destroyed my son. Maybe if I help bring down the man who taught me to do it, I can find some way to live with myself." I thought about the federal investigation, about how much stronger the case would be with inside testimony from someone who'd witnessed 20 years of corruption. "There's no going back from that," I said. "Charles will go to prison. You'll lose everything anyway." "I know, and I still won't forgive you." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I know that too." I gave her the number for the FBI field agent handling Charles's case. She left without saying goodbye, driving away in her white Lexus toward a future that would destroy everything she'd spent her life protecting. 3 hours later, my surveillance equipment picked up Charles screaming into his phone. "What do you mean she's cooperating with federal investigators?" December arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the lake ice sound like gunshots in the night. Charles's construction empire was officially bankrupt, the business assets seized by federal marshals pending the corruption investigation. Natalie was working at a diner outside town, her teaching career finished and her savings exhausted by legal fees. But I wasn't done. The anonymous tip I sent to Channel 7 News contained 20 years' worth of documented evidence, bank records, bribes, safety violations, and the sexual harassment cover-up that had kept a predator in the classroom for 3 years. Everything cross-referenced and verified, presented in a format that made it impossible to ignore. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Local construction magnate accused of decades-long corruption scheme. By noon, every news station in the state was running the story. By evening, CNN had picked it up as an example of small-town political corruption. I watched from my motel room as news vans surrounded Charles's office building. Reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving. Camera crews filmed the Dawson construction sign like it was evidence in a murder trial. Charles himself had gone to ground, holed up in the lake house with lawyers and bourbon. But Natalie was still exposed, still working her shifts at the diner, still pretending she could weather this storm. That's where I chose to make my final move. Wednesday afternoon, I walked into Mickey's diner wearing a baseball cap and work clothes that made me look like any other contractor grabbing lunch. Natalie was working the afternoon shift, moving between tables with the mechanical efficiency of someone trying not to think too hard about how far she'd fallen. She didn't recognize me until I sat down in her section. "Hello, Natalie." Her face went white. The coffee pot in her hand started shaking. "Clay, we thought you were dead? Gone? Too stupid to figure out what you were doing?" She looked around the diner like she was planning an escape route. 3 other customers, none paying attention to us. The cook in the kitchen, radio playing classic rock. "What do you want?" she whispered. "To talk. Sit down." "I'm working." "Sit down, or I'll make this conversation loud enough for everyone to hear." Natalie slid into the booth across from me, her hands folded tight to stop the shaking. 23 years of marriage, I said quietly. 23 years of you making me feel like I wasn't good enough, smart enough, successful enough. Making me grateful for scraps of affection while you planned my destruction with my own father. Clay, we didn't plan for it to happen. The affair? No, that was just opportunity. But selling my cottage? Forging my signature on documents? Spreading rumors about my mental health to justify throwing me away? That was planning. Tears started running down her cheeks. I never wanted to hurt you. You wanted me gone. You wanted my father's money and status and my absence from his life. The only question is how long you'd been working toward it. I pulled out my phone and opened the audio app. Remember this conversation? I pressed play. Her own voice filled the space between us. Clay's too stupid to figure anything out. We just need to be patient until the divorce goes through. Natalie's face crumpled. Where did you get that? Same place I got the bank records showing you've been stealing from the teachers' union fund. Same place I got the evidence about you covering up sexual harassment complaints. Same place I got 20 years of documentation showing exactly what kind of people you and Charles really are. She was sobbing now, but trying to keep quiet in the public space. What do you want? She asked again. I want you to understand something. For 20 years, you and Charles made me believe I was the problem, made me think I was too damaged, too broken, too worthless to deserve better. But it was never about me being broken. It was about you being rotten. I stood up and dropped a $10 bill on the table. The federal prosecutors have everything now. The bank records, the recordings, the witness testimony. Charles is going to prison, you're going to prison, and I'm going to watch it happen from the front row. Clay, please. The only reason I came here was to make sure you understood that this isn't random justice or bad luck or karma. This is me, the worthless son, the broken veteran. The failure you thought you could discard? I walked toward the door, then turned back. Oh, and Natalie? Next time you ruin someone's life, make sure they're actually as stupid as you think they are. The trial began in March, when the lake ice was breaking up, and the whole town smelled like mud and new beginnings. Federal courthouse in Minneapolis, big enough to handle the media circus that Charles's case had become. I sat in the gallery every day, watching my father in his expensive suits try to maintain dignity while prosecutors systematically destroyed his reputation. 20 years of corruption laid out in charts and graphs and recorded phone calls that made him sound exactly like what he was, a small-town criminal who'd thought he was smarter than everyone else. Natalie pled guilty to embezzlement and conspiracy charges on the third day of testimony. She got 18 months in federal prison and full restitution of stolen funds. The judge called her a trusted educator who betrayed her community and her profession. Charles fought to the end, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy by jealous business rivals and corrupt investigators. His lawyers painted him as a successful entrepreneur being persecuted by a system that resented his achievements. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all charges: bribery, conspiracy, tax evasion, fraud. 23 years in federal prison, plus forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. When the verdict was read, Charles looked across the courtroom and made eye contact with me for the first time since this all began. I saw recognition in his face, finally understanding who had orchestrated his destruction. I smiled and nodded. He looked away. Evelyn got immunity in exchange for her testimony, but lost everything anyway. The lake house, the cars, the comfortable life she'd protected by staying silent. She moved to a one-bedroom apartment across town and got a job at the grocery store, starting over at 60 with nothing but the knowledge that she'd finally done the right thing. Rick Maddox settled his lawsuit for $2 million from the bankruptcy estate. He used the money to start his own security consulting business, specializing in investigating construction fraud. Turned out, he was good at it. Elena and I dissolved Martinez Dawson Consulting after the trials ended. She went back to HVAC work, and I started my own construction company, specializing in honest work for honest money. Funny how much easier it was to build a reputation when you weren't fighting against 20 years of being told you were worthless. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. They held a shareholders' meeting for the bankruptcy proceedings in May, a formality to liquidate the remaining assets of Dawson Construction. The court required all stakeholders to attend, including family members who might have claims against the estate. Charles was there in shackles, transported from federal holding. Natalie attended by video link from her prison cell. Evelyn sat in the back row looking like she'd aged 10 years and 6 months. And me. I sat in the front row, wearing the kind of suit I'd never been able to afford when I was fixing air conditioners for a living. The meeting was supposed to be procedural, just signatures and formalities. But when the judge asked if anyone had final statements regarding the dissolution of the business, I stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to address the court. Charles's lawyer started to object, but the judge waved him quiet. You have something relevant to these proceedings, Mr. Dawson? I do, Your Honor. I want to make sure the record is clear about how this company operated and why it's being dissolved. I turned to face Charles, who was staring at me with unconcealed hatred. For 20 years, you built an empire by cutting corners, bribing officials, and stealing from taxpayers. You convinced yourself you were smarter than everyone else, that rules didn't apply to you, that people like me were too stupid to matter. The courtroom was completely silent. You taught me I was worthless. You taught my mother to choose comfort over conscience. You taught my wife that loyalty was something to be sold to the highest bidder. You built a family on lies and a business on corruption, and you were proud of both. Charles's face was red with rage, but the shackles kept him in his seat. But here's what you never understood. Worthless people have nothing left to lose. Broken people know how to survive destruction. And stupid people? Sometimes they're smart enough to let you destroy yourself. I pulled out a flash drive. Not the original one that had started this whole thing, but a new one containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the past year. This contains recordings of you planning tax evasion, bribing city officials, and discussing how to frame construction accidents as acts of God for insurance purposes. It contains your conversations about covering up safety violations that could have killed people. And it contains your own words describing exactly how little you think of the son who just brought down your entire criminal organization. I placed the flash drive on the court reporter's desk. I'm donating this evidence to the FBI's continuing investigation into municipal corruption in our county. Because even from prison, I want to make sure you understand that this isn't over. Every dirty deal you made, every person you corrupted, every life you damaged, it's all going to come out. Charles finally found his voice. You think you've won something? You destroyed your own family. Your own mother is living in poverty because of you. No, I said calmly. She's living with the consequences of choices she made 30 years ago, just like you are. I turned to address Natalie's image on the video screen. And you, 23 years you made me feel grateful for scraps of affection while you planned to throw me away like garbage. You convinced me I was lucky to have someone like you, that I should try harder to deserve your love. But you never loved me. You loved what I represented, a way to get close to money and power you couldn't earn yourself. Natalie was crying on the screen, but I felt nothing watching her tears. You both spent decades making me feel small and worthless and broken. You made me believe I deserved nothing better than the crumbs of life you were willing to give me. But here's what you never realized. When you take everything from someone, you also set them free. I looked back at Charles, who was staring at me with something that might have been respect mixed with the hatred. You built an empire on my back and buried me alive under your expectations and disappointments. You taught me that I was nothing, that I mattered to no one, that I would never amount to anything. I smiled, feeling the weight of 20 years of humiliation and rage finally lifting from my shoulders. Now it's your turn to suffocate. The judge banged his gavel as Charles lunged forward in his shackles, screaming profanities that echoed off the courtroom walls. Security guards restrained him while his lawyer tried to calm him down. Natalie was sobbing on the video screen, and Evelyn had her face in her hands. I walked out of the courthouse into the warm May sunshine, listening to the sound of my father's rage fade behind me. The lake stretched out blue and endless in the distance, full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. For the first time in 20 years, I was exactly where I belonged. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Saw the news coverage? You okay? I typed back, better than okay. Want to grab dinner and talk about that new commercial contract? She responded immediately. Thought you'd never ask. Pick me up at 7. I drove through town, past the empty lot where my grandfather's cottage used to stand, past the shuttered offices of Dawson Construction, past the diner where Natalie had served her last customers before federal marshals came for her. This place had tried to break me, had convinced me I was too small for anything better, too damaged for real success, too stupid to see what was happening right in front of me. But I'd learned something important over the past year. When people underestimate you completely, they give you all the tools you need to destroy them. The lake stretched out ahead of me as I drove toward my future, finally understanding that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's becoming everything they said you'd never be.